Welcome to Civic Punks, and I'm very excited to do a special episode, I guess we'll call it, with Tamara here, Tamara Zakharia. Although, how is it actually pronounced? Because I know I'm
It's
doing this wrong.
pronounced Tamara Zakharia.
Zakharia. Amazing. Who is actually coming in from Lebanon days before your wedding, which I really appreciate, to do a special episode on a report that the UN commissioned you to do, all about how do we foster innovation in government. So I am super keen to dig into this with you. But before we dig into the report and all that kind of stuff, tell me more about yourself. Who are you, and what is the journey you took to get to this point?
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for having me, and really excited about having this discussion because we've been discussing this offline, and it's been interesting enough to bring it to an online forum. So yeah, thanks for that. A bit about me. I mean, I'm going to potentially be a bit corny and say like my entire professional career has been like following the impact thread. And that's kind of how I landed where I am at this moment in my professional journey. I did almost 7 to 8 years with the UN, particularly with UNICEF. And I did a lot of work on youth skilling programs, and then eventually started working with the Office of Innovation to scale those programs from one country to another. And then in doing that, I started to realize that scaling something innovative, whether it's a program or it's a project, requires an infrastructure to scale. And that started being the new thing that I wanted to work on. So not just the project or program itself, because a lot of that I did with governments around the world. So I did some with Tajikistan, with Panama, with Jordan, Lebanon, and that was all really great. But then what does it take to take something that's successful in Lebanon and make it also successful in another place? And then I started exploring the infrastructure within UNICEF and within governments that is required to do that. And that's when I started thinking of UNICEF, and a lot of the UN has country offices, and those country offices are the offices within a specific country that sign all the partnership strategy documents with the governments that they are within the country that they're serving. And then within those country offices, there are internationals and nationals that work there. And when you bring in an innovation coming in from another project, there's so much to consider. Like, what is the capacity of the staff there? Is it the same problem that you're trying to solve? Do they have the infrastructure? Do they have the funding? Like, so many things. Is it aligned with the cooperation they have in place with the government? Is it aligned with like the broader offers strategy? So that's when I came up with something called Compass. Compass came from those questions that I had. And right now it's a UNICEF flagship program. Essentially what it does, it puts country offices into cohorts and helps them figure out what is their innovation strategy. And by strategy, it doesn't have to be like a 100-page document. It's like, why are we doing this and how are we doing it and how are we prioritizing resources to make this happen? And then based on that, you look at this incoming innovation and you figure out, is this for me or is it not? Is there something else that would work? Is it that I need to change something that I'm already doing? Or is it that I need to import something from my local ecosystem, whether it's tech ecosystem or whether it's the private sector? So it really helps country offices think together in a cohort approach about how, like, why innovation beyond, because it can be a bit of a buzzword and mean everything and nothing. Why am I doing this? Why do I want to do this? And what's right for me? And then once I have those questions answered, what is the infrastructure I need? Do I have the funding? Do I have the people? Do I have the skills? Do I have the capacity? Do I have the right partners? Is the government open to these things? So all the different building blocks in the report, they're called enablers. All those building blocks, do I have these things? And if I don't, what do I need to make them happen? So it's really pushing like the innovation itself into the backseat and putting the infrastructure around an innovation in the front seat, because sometimes an idea works and sometimes it doesn't. But once you have the right infrastructure, that doesn't really matter so much. And once you have the direction and a narrative, a coherent narrative and logic that cuts across everything, then you have the infrastructure to really do it over and over again. And I think that's what's really important. So yeah, I went from like running a program to working within the Office of Innovation to scale programs like the ones I created and ran, and then kept on following that impact thread to like, we need to help these things land properly. But then where that took me was that, sure, we can do this really well for UNICEF, and the office can be super prepared and equipped to absorb this from another place or innovate themselves. But then the only way you're reaching children at the last mile is mostly through government infrastructure. And that's it is what's ultimately the most important, that you're reaching children who most need this innovation. What I realized is that you can do all your homework as an organization, but if government does not speak that language, doesn't appreciate it, doesn't understand it, doesn't have the proper infrastructure, your scalability and impact is always going to be very limited. And that's when I continued to follow that impact thread and decided that I want to be there. And that's when I left UNICEF. I moved to the UK, started working for a public sector design innovation firm called TPX Impact, formerly known as FutureGov, and yeah, have been working with, adjacent to, and in government teams on public sector innovation design since. Yeah.
It's interesting because there's a lot from that story that I can relate to within my own story. I think I was driven to government in some ways for similar reasons, in the sense that, you realize how important government is in terms of setting the context that this all sits within. The other thing that's really interesting about your story that jumped out at me is how this whole idea of starting with a specific problem or a specific project, and then realizing that you can only move things so far without looking at the larger context. And there's so many people who I see working at the more systemic level at innovation within government context that have been pulled up to that level really out of frustration at the specific project they were working on, and they got stuck. And the reason they got stuck is because of larger systemic factors. It's like, okay, I got to move up the chain to get the space to really move this thing I care about forward. This led you to create a report. So what's the story behind this report? Where did the report come from, and what are the goals with this report?
Yeah, the report, it was a few things. So it was a report and a bit of a framework and a narrative that was commissioned by UNDESA. Under the project called Strengthening Public Sector Capacities for Delivering a 2030 Agenda, and it was specifically for 4 project target countries, so Malaysia, Philippines, Thailand, and Vietnam. And the objective of the report was to create the objective of the project was to create 3 different outputs. So 1 was a trends report, and 2 was a bit of a framework to frame the conversation with these 4 countries, and 3rd was a deck to bring that to life in the workshop that you're going to be going to in Samarkand. And the trends report was really focused on just like, what are the basics of public sector innovation without a focus on tech? Because this had to be relevant for countries that were really early in their public sector innovation journey, potentially could possibly not have a very strong digital infrastructure, but innovation still could be relevant to them. There is a huge shift from there isn't a focus on tech, and that's very deliberate. And, it was really meant to surface like what's happened, and a lot of the literature. So the report came out of almost a month and a half of writing and research. It was mostly desktop research because of the limited time that was available, and a few interviews. And yeah, it's meant to like give a very high level view to start a discussion more than anything else, to enable UNDESA to be able to start that conversation with these 4 project countries. And how do we start to think of public sector innovation? Because this project is, if I'm not mistaken, it's a 3-year project, and this is like the first step in that. And it's like, it was the starter to those conversations.
I think one of the things that really has been really exciting and interesting for me with diving into this report and having conversations with you about this is that I've been playing around in the innovation space for a while, but for the most part, it's in countries that are fairly well developed in innovation, countries like Canada, countries like the United Kingdom, Australia. And this came from a different perspective. And it's working with countries that are in a different place, more developing economies. They're just, like you said, earlier in their journey, but also it's not just that they're earlier in their journey, the context they sit within. The political realities, the infrastructure realities are different than you would find in a country like Canada and the UK. And so for me, that's been sort of really refreshing as a different angle to look at this. So one place I think a good place to start is like, I mean, what do we mean by public sector innovation? Like you said earlier, it's a bit of a buzzword. How did you sort of scope this for the report? How would you define it?
Yeah, I mean, when we think of public sector innovation, I think a lot of us tend to think of the government creating a startup ecosystem for entrepreneurs and innovators outside of government. Our default isn't necessarily like how can government be innovative. I even had someone tell me it's a bit of an oxymoron statement.
I mean, yeah, it's interesting. I'm a big fan of Mariana Mazzucato's work in this area, where she's trying to
Yeah.
reframe. It's like no, government actually is a really important place to play in the innovation space. But it's true that's not how most people see it. Even most people in government don't see government as a potential key actor in the innovation space.
Yeah, and I think what was really important for me in this report, and because it was the starter of a longer project for countries with Vendessa, was to start from the same point. Because when it's something when it's a big buzzword like innovation, which could mean again anything and nothing, it's really easy to start from many different viewpoints and understandings, which doesn't level the conversation and allow it to be the most constructive. So yeah, what I did in the report is I started off with what is public sector innovation, and it's like government trying new things to create value for citizens. If I'm being extremely simple about it, I wasn't that simple in the report, but that's the essence of it. And then the second thing is like, and maybe this is more top of mind just because of what's been happening very recently in the states and Dodge. Like what does public sector innovation, what does innovation mean in the public sector? Is it the same as what innovation is in the private sector? And it really isn't. There's so much more at stake in the public sector. You can't just go in and break things. Every entrepreneur will say, just go in and break things and just move fast. And governments have so much responsibilities and statutory limitations and just lives relying on them. You can't approach an innovation in the same manner you would when you're starting a startup. So I think I really wanted to make that differentiation, and that there are commonalities, and innovation is instigated by almost like the same type of person in both the private and public sector. The entrepreneur is the person who sees a problem and wants to solve it, but the limitations of it and how it's measured and what its success is and why it's being done are to some extent fundamentally different, and the level of risk and just how it's approached is different. And what I do say in the report is that government is, and it's from research, isn't really my opinion, mostly that governments do opt for incremental slash absorptive innovation versus radical innovation because of the appetite for risk and the responsibilities and just how complex the system is.
This is probably good. You sent me the slides, so I'm gonna bring them in. Let's see here.
Yeah, let's do
Let's
that.
do this. Window. Yes, I think I got this. Super technical here. So these are sort of the three that you're just talking about, the three different types. So you got incremental, absorptive, and radical. Could you very quickly just define how they're different?
Yeah, I mean, incremental and absorptive are actually a bit of those Russian dolls. Like absorptive can be part of incremental, but essentially incremental is when you see something and slightly improve it in a new way. Absorptive is when you adopt something external internally into government, and then radical is when you completely go in and just break something and do something completely new. And most common type of innovation within government is incremental. Then comes absorptive. The least common is radical. And it's really because innovation in government is just measured very differently and has different parameters than innovation within the private sector.
Yeah, that makes. I mean, one of the things I think that's interesting about it, governments talk a lot about bringing innovation in from the private sector. It seems to be a common theme. But of course, one of the challenges, and I was just listening to a really interesting Planet Money did an interview about someone who had worked on the Doge project, and that was one of the assumptions. It's like, oh, we'll come in, we'll move fast, break things, and we'll bring in the best ideas from the private sector into government. And one of their journey was with that was like, oh, government is very different than the private sector in many ways, and you can't just adopt it and absorb it. There's a translation piece that has to come into this. But I want to actually jump into your actual model, because I think this is sort of the centerpiece of this report. Let's see here. Haha. This is the model that you built to sort of encapsulate how you think government should be thinking about and approaching innovation. Can you walk me through this model? There's a lot going on here.
A lot. I mean, I like to visualize things because that's how my brain works, and I really wanted to put this together because there's so many different pieces in the report, and I feel like a visual always prompts a conversation, whether it's an agreement or a disagreement or something. It always brings out something helpful as opposed to just reading a report. So essentially, what I wanted to do is I wanted to anchor the report in a logic. And this is kind of the translation of that logic into a framework. And essentially, what we have here on the side are the intended outcomes. And we can speak more about that, but essentially, like, public sector innovation has to have an intended outcome. Why am I doing this? It has to be clear. It has to be clear to everyone involved that why are we doing this, and everything needs to align with that outcome. Those outcomes will come at different, they are intertwined. There is a slide about that we can get into, but those outcomes will touch upon different parts of this journey or different parts of the framework. So improved decision making, increased operational efficiency, those are things that are slightly back end. They will have ripple effects on citizens eventually, but primarily they are back end to government systems. And then better citizen engagement and better services are things that citizens, residents will see as direct outcomes. They are very intertwined. It's not like we can at all separate them, but they do touch upon different parts of the framework. And then there are the risks and challenges, and there's a chapter on that. And then atop all of this sits national strategy and leadership. And one thing I do emphasize in the report is that it isn't always the starting point. It doesn't have to be the starting point. But for the purpose of this report, because the mandate was to specifically look at a whole of government approach, how do we get all of government involved in innovation? And to do that, you need a coherent narrative, and that generally comes with a strategy or mandate from leadership. But again, like in the report, we do mention that isn't always the starting point for countries. We could start with a pilot that eventually leads up to that. And then under that, innovation governance, which is like, we know where we want to get to and we know why we want to get there, but how do we create the infrastructure for that to happen? Who does what? How do the pieces of the system connect? Who can do what? How are we authorizing different things? So that's the machine that allows this to happen, and there are different models of governance that can be adopted based on also your context. So it can be a very centralized model, and within that there are different also models that you can adopt. And there's a more decentralized model, and there's a hybrid model where central government and local government more work together. There's a whole section on different innovation governance models, and then within that system sits institutional internal enablers and then those enablers are the different parts of the system that will enable or disable innovation, such as funding, such as regulations, such as capacity and capability, and so on. And then there are the wider national enablers that a lot of the times will sit completely outside of all PSI public sector innovation efforts. Sometimes they don't, but sometimes they do. And these are the wider national contexts, such as a digital public infrastructure, which is sometimes much wider than just public sector innovation. Mm-hmm. So partnerships, working with the private sector, these are different components that sit outside of the system but influence it greatly, can enable it or disable it. And then you have the residents, citizens, and businesses. This is a very simple, basic model of just like how things in the framework can speak to each other. It doesn't like speak to much more sophisticated ways of how residents, citizens, and businesses can be involved in government. And yeah,
But I think
does
it's a
that
good
make
starting
sense?
point. Yeah, and I think, I mean, one of the things I think this model does do is it puts the key pieces all onto one place. And then obviously how you organize it and how you interact with all these different elements is going to be unique to your context. But the fact is that these are the elements you're going to have to be considering as you approach the innovation. One of the things that, following in a conversation you and I had previously that was helpful for me was this recognition that I think a lot of governments right away focus on this national strategy for innovation. And I think that actually can slow them down and also dismiss where there's innovation already happening in these little different pockets. And so one of the things you said that was really helpful that I kind of want to emphasize is that, and you mentioned here as well, you don't need to start with your strategy. Just figure out like where's innovation happening and build from that point. That said, the strategy piece you mentioned was really helpful for scaling. If you want to scale the stuff that's happening, this is where the strategy comes in. A piece that I'm particularly interested in drilling down on more is governance, because this is where I think things get messy. I think this is where it's one thing to develop a strategy, and that's a lot of work, but where things get interesting and complex and messy is the implementation of the strategy. And this is where the governance piece comes in, particularly because innovation is systemic usually. You're dealing with all these different actors, the different ones you mentioned. So let's dig more into the governance stuff, and let's see if I can find the slide here. You talk about the different types, but I want to sort of give a bit more space to talk and dig into the governance piece of this. So you talk about three different types of governance models. Where do you see these different models working, and where do they not work?
So a central innovation governance model is going to be really helpful if you have a top-down mandate. If you have a top-down mandate, very clear leadership, injection of funding, very strong central government, that could be a case where a centralized central innovation governance model is going to work. You have that very clear direction from the top. You have the infrastructure being built from the top. You have the funding being injected from the top. And I mean, it would potentially work more for smaller countries. It isn't the case all the time, but you see it in very recently in the Gulf countries. If you look at KSA, Bahrain, UAE, these are countries that have done extremely well in fast tracking their innovation digital capacity within government. The infrastructure and the governance models were all quite central governance models. One, because there was a very clear leadership to do that from the top of government, but maybe not in the case of Saudi Arabia, but in the case of Bahrain and UAE, it was a small enough country. And also, it does make it easier when you're not dealing with a lot of legacy systems. Legacy systems make all of this really, really complicated. And when you're not dealing with legacy systems, and you can say, let it exist and make it exist, those legacy systems, the lack of those legacy systems does help a lot.
So legacy systems. So you're referring to like legacy policy, legacy, like what do you mean by this term of legacy systems?
I mean, a lot of it, I mean, legacy tech is one of the big ones here. I think it's sometimes a huge issue when you want to come in and you want to go about innovation and digitization in a slightly different manner. You have to bridge systems, you have to move data, it's very costly to take out old systems, bring in new systems that are slightly better connected, more user-centered. allow you to interact with residents in an easier way, just because you're able to share data across government in an easier way, look at trends and predict what residents and citizens might need. So I think it's much easier to build when you don't have a legacy and tech systems from scratch. That's slightly on a tangent.
So it's almost like it's like muck that just makes things so much slow. It just slows down everything
Yeah,
else in the
yeah,
process.
100%. Because if you're starting from, if you don't have all of those legacy systems, and you because a big problem you see across governments is that the data systems don't speak to each other.
Yeah.
And because of those data systems don't speak to each other, it just means that you can't deliver services the way a resident or citizen would want you to deliver those services. They have to give you their data 100 times to different departments. The departments, they don't speak to each other. Their data isn't shared. The way their needs are read isn't cohesive across government. The way their needs are predicted also isn't cohesive across government. Yeah, that's a bit on why starting from even if I think of Lebanon today, like we don't have a lot of what is in government is still paper based. Not all of it, of course, but we still have a large bit of government that's paper based, and sometimes that isn't so bad.
Yeah.
It just
It
means
makes
you
it
can.
makes it safer to a certain extent from like cybersecurity risk and stuff like that. It's one of the funny things about legacy is on one hand it holds us back from doing lots of really interesting and cool stuff. It adds a lot of the muck and the stuff that we're talking about. But man, it also is a oddly effective security mechanism sometimes.
Yeah, absolutely. And also like helps you if you don't you can just come in with a new system
Mhm.
without having to migrate data and deal with contracts and so on and so forth.
One of the things that the other thing that you mentioned was central that I think is really important is the money piece. That
Mm.
central innovation governance models work well if the central body has money to push out, because that's a form of you almost have to like central government innovation. Like the central governance model works when you have centralized power and are able to push that power out, and money is one of the most effective ways of pushing that out. And that's something that just stuck in my head as you were talking about that. Okay, decentralized.
Decentralized is really, really helpful when you have, and not even helpful, it just emerges when you have a decentralized government, like almost a federal state, when there isn't necessarily coordination across. They could potentially speak to one another, but when you have different parts of local government doing different things, just because that's also how the country is organized. There is a high level of autonomy between different regions or areas or local governments and authorities that they have the mandate to do that. So what emerges is that they have different priorities and ways of approaching innovation. And one example, we can look at Spain. It's a
Mm.
highly decentralized country, and you can see different regions adopt different approaches to innovation, and they're all great, but they all serve the context of that region, and I think it mimics the nature of the country. So yeah,
One, I think one of the other things that I think about sort of flip to like when you have lots of power and resources to be moving around, centralization works. But if you don't have a lot of power and resources, all of a sudden decentralization becomes a way more effective way of getting things out, which I thought was kind of an interesting way of looking at it. So we've
mm.
talked about centralized, we've talked about decentralized. Where does the hybrid fit into all this?
I mean it's a nice mix, quite which is quite common in that it's a mix of central central government central government providing a mandate. It doesn't need to provide necessarily a mandate all the time. It can provide something along the lines of helping connect or helping fund or helping support or giving a mandate, but then allowing local governments and authorities set their own mandate, but in a really supported way. So it's it's also, I mean, depends on the context, but it is something that is quite common, and you'll see across governments, in that central government plays less of a I don't want to say controlling, but takes less of a full ownership role, and more so supports, and then allows local government to work out what works best for their context, but also tries to maintain a narrative across all the different parts of the system, across public sector innovation, which sometimes makes it more efficient and sometimes doesn't, and does the opposite. So it really depends.
So I guess a key question I have is like this distinction between like centralization is clearly that's clear. The government is driving the central government is driving the bus in all of this. I'm still trying to draw the distinction between decentralization and hybrid. So in hybrid, the central government's still involved. They might have a vision, they might have resources, but it's less top down than the centralized model. Correct?
Yes.
That's a good.
Decentralized is kind of, I would say, is when there isn't a national mandate, national leadership, a national fund, a national something. It's really different parts of the system doing their own thing, and to some extent doing it really successfully. But it is less coordinated. It is less supported in many ways. It doesn't mean it works.
Right.
It doesn't work as good, but yeah.
All right, let's jump into enablers, which I think is in some ways the most interesting part of this. What enables innovation in these contexts? And you talk about, let's see here, slides over. You talk about both internal and external enablers within the innovation ecosystem. So let's start with some internal ones. You list four here. Can you walk me through those four and how they are enabling innovation within a government context?
I mean, innovation very rarely thrives in a vacuum, whether it's an entrepreneur or whether it's a project in a company, or I mean, the same applies to government. As much as one would like to allocate the success of a thing to the founder, the innovator, the truth really is that there's a whole network of people and events, milestones that have supported that person or that team to achieve that, and the same stands true for government. So some of the enablers that we've identified that will allow public sector innovation to thrive are, one, funding, and there are different modalities of how do you fund innovation within government that we dive in the report with examples. Human resources, people, the backbone of almost any innovation. Admin, legal, and regulatory frameworks, and I think these are more important in government than they would be elsewhere because of the restrictions of government that can constrain innovation a lot. What you see sometimes is that governments create specific circulars that allow this part of government to do something new without having to go through all the bureaucratic steps of needing to do that. That allows innovation to thrive. I think it was Denmark that also had a legislation around allowing municipalities to experiment. So there's a lot on how do we mitigate risk in a way that still allows innovation to thrive, and a lot of that falls into the territory of admin, legal, and regulatory frameworks, because I mean, I used to even see it in the UN. A lot of creativity and innovation is stifled by just like how many approvals you need to get to do something. By the time you get to the 100th paper you need to sign, it's almost done. It's so disencouraging. So That's another pillar of that. And then there's just culture. If people are terrified to fail, to make a mistake, not a lot of them will go out on a limb to do it. If the culture is not a culture that allows for that to happen, and culture means a lot of things, right? And we go into that in the report. But if the culture isn't hospitable, it also really discourages innovation. It doesn't allow it to thrive. Obviously, there are a few things, there are a few other pillars that are missing, but we purposely didn't get into the report, such as like digital infrastructure and data. But for the purpose of this report, those weren't things we wanted to delve into because we wanted to focus on non-tech. But obviously, those are pillars that are equally important.
So if I to summarize these pillars, so funding is literally just having money available to support innovative ideas and practices, whether that's large scale like mandated money or just loose money that people can jump into and dive in as the opportunities provides. Human resources is really about having bringing in and nurturing, supporting talent that has the skill sets to innovate, and that could also be upskilling within the public service in terms of skill sets and training. Admin, legal, regular frameworks. When you're talking about that, honestly, what came to mind was like labs or like sandboxes. A lot of governments use sandboxes, but just that safe space that separates you from all of the red tape that gets in the way of innovation. And then the culture one, which in some ways is the one I find most interesting. It seems that the examples you talked about really dial down to like leadership, the role that leadership plays in enabling everyone around them to work in different ways, whether it's taking risks and failing, and that's okay, bringing forward ideas that you think might be crazy, and not being afraid to do that. This idea of fear being something that hinders an innovative culture, which is something that we definitely hear a lot of in the public services, this fear to do things differently, that risk aversion. Okay, what about external enablers?
So, yeah, I mean, a big part of this is going to be partnerships. A government does not exist in vacuum. Partnerships, whether it's with the private sector or it's with academia, those partnerships are going to enable government to innovate and deliver on what they'd like to drive as innovation. Yeah, partnerships is a big one, and that's something that sits outside of the public sector innovation system. It's something that is just part of the country infrastructure that will highly influence whether the nature of what public sector innovation is within that country and what's possible and what isn't. And then there's just infrastructure, things like trust and citizen engagement. If you're going to start rolling out some AI apps and you have very, very little trust amongst citizens, then the success of that is going to be limited because they will be possibly unwilling to interact with that. So trust and citizen engagement, that isn't something that is necessarily just dictated by whatever strategy or whatever effort that you push or launch through public sector innovation. Digital literacy, that's an important one. Digital public infrastructure. I mean, at some point, a component of what you're going to need to deliver on public sector innovation at the scale of what this at a scalable rate will require digital public infrastructure and will require that people are able to interact with you. And if it's going to be in a scalable manner, then that has to have a digital component to it. Connectivity and digital access, and then cyber security as well. These a lot of this is tied to the digital component, digital components of public sector innovation, and of course cloud computing and scalable digital infrastructure. So these are all things that don't sit within a public sector innovation system, but that will heavily influence its mandate, how it's shaped, and what its limitations and parameters are.
Well, it's interesting. I have so many thoughts. I'm trying to think where to go first. But I think one of the things for me with the infrastructure piece that's interesting is that another infrastructure I would add to this is this idea of like social capital within civil society. Like if you have a
Mm,
really strong civil society, lots of different clubs and groups, churches, faith organizations, that actually provides a huge infrastructure that can be tapped into by government to nurture innovation. The other thing that came to mind for me with the partnership piece was that one of the things that I know I experimented with a bunch when I worked in the government is this recognition that in government you are limited in what you can do, but
mm,
maybe the partners can do stuff that you can't do. So how do you enable your partners? So we couldn't. I worked in national government for Canada. There's a lot we couldn't do there. We were tied by the rules and the regulations, but the local governments were way more nimble. They just lacked resources and expertise. But we had resources and expertise. So the partnership became one where we fed in our resources and expertise to support local governments. Or you see this work really well oftentimes in the private sector, where the private sector can just move faster and take risks the public sector can't. And so the question is like building partnerships that allow each part of the ecosystem, each partner, to be able to lean into their strengths and mitigate each other's weaknesses, which I think is has been helpful for me in terms of thinking of what how to really foster innovation within a larger society.
100% couldn't agree more. I think, I mean, government does not exist in a vacuum, and it's really difficult to talk about public sector innovation for government without looking at the partner. It's a missed opportunity to not consider partners
Mm.
when we think of public sector innovation.
I think the challenge with it is that government, I can speak my own, I am a proliferator of this as even though I don't want to be, I'm just as bad as everybody else, is that this idea of trusting other parts of the system. In government, there's a sense of skepticism sometimes towards the private sector, or maybe academia being too slow, or whatever it is. There's I think a lot of distrust between the different partners within an ecosystem, and so one of the biggest things is building trust between these different partners, and really that comes down to relationship building. Like
Yeah,
old school, just classic building relationships with people and trusting each other is so important to actually creating this innovation ecosystem.
it really is. It is exactly that. I mean, we can talk about frameworks and systems as much as we want, but it comes down to how do you build relationships, how do you build trust with different actors in your system, and how do you work together to achieve those goals?
All right. Well, tomorrow I know we got to wrap up soon. So my final question for you is really what did you think is the most important thing that people take away from this report? And maybe a part of that is like what surprised you the most from this experience?
Good questions. What do I hope people take away from this report? I think what this report does it highlights so many different ways you can approach innovation, so many different examples of different countries doing different things and for different reasons. And I think that that's kind of the point. You just need to figure out, there's no copy paste model, and this might sound a bit generic, but there really isn't. There is no copy paste model. It's just there are so many different ways to approach this. And I think what's most important is that starting with the why. Why am I doing this? And that's kind of the Northern Star. Why do I want to innovate? Why is public sector innovation important? And I think once that's clear, then no matter what governance system you put, whether you have a strategy, if it's one-page strategy or a 100-page strategy, or it's a deck, or no matter how you decide to fund things, or, I mean, it will come down to context and what strengths and weaknesses, and the history of public sector innovation in that country. But yeah, I would say it really comes down to what I'd like people to take away is what is your why? Why is public sector innovation important? What would you like to see as an outcome for the people of your country? And then work from there. That's how I framed the report as an opening. What are your desired outcomes? And I think everything else you just figure out as you go.
Amazing. Tamara, thank you so much for making time and for sharing your insights and doing the work on this report. And I am excited. Yes, the next step for me is to turn this into a workshop along with Robin and Victoria at the UN. And I'll let you know how that goes. Enjoy your wedding.
Thank you.
And yeah, thank you. Thank you so much.
No, thank you so much, and look forward to hearing about the workshop.